In 1931, a single soup kitchen in Chicago served 3,000 people a day, and it was funded by Al Capone. The gangster who terrorized the city fed more hungry Americans than the government did that winter. Number 7 on this list was the meal his kitchen ladled out by the thousands. Number 3 cost less than a penny per serving. Number 1 fed more Americans through the 1930s than any relief program on record. These were not recipes, they were survival. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down. Number 25, watered vegetable soup. This was the meal that met you at the door of every relief kitchen in America. A cook would take whatever the city could beg, borrow, or salvage from the produce market at closing time. The bruised carrots, the limp celery, the onions too soft to sell, and drop it all into a kettle the size of a bathtub. Water covered everything. A ham bone if the church had one. Salt if the barrel was not empty. Then it simmered for hours until the whole thing turned into something thin, warm, and endless. The genius was not flavor. The genius was arithmetic. A single kettle could stretch to feed 400 men, and when the line got longer, the cook just added more water and more salt and stirred. In the winter of 1932, kitchens in New York served this soup to lines that wrapped around 3 city blocks. Men stood in the cold for 2 hours to get a bowl. Nobody complained about the recipe. They were grateful the pot was still full when they reached the front. Number 24, bread and coffee. Before there was any hot meal, there was bread and coffee, and for millions of Americans, that was the entire supper. The bread was day-old, donated by bakeries that could not sell it, sliced thick, and handed out 1 piece per person. The coffee was weak, stretched with chicory, or boiled a second time from grounds already used that morning. A loaf of bread cost about 8 cents in 1932, but for a man out of work, 8 cents might as well have been $8. Soup kitchens gave it away because it was the cheapest thing that filled a stomach. Men dunked the stale bread in the hot coffee to soften it, and the coffee gave them just enough warmth and just enough caffeine to keep walking, keep looking for work, keep going. Photographs from the bread lines of the era show men holding nothing but a slice and a tin cup. That was dinner. That was everything the day had to offer. Number 23, cornmeal mush. When the flour ran low, cornmeal stepped in because cornmeal was the cheapest grain in the country. A relief cook boiled it in water with a pinch of salt until it thickened into a heavy gray-gold porridge that stuck to the ribs and stayed there. A bag of cornmeal cost pennies and could feed dozens. Served hot in the morning with a thread of molasses, if there was any, it filled a stomach for hours. What made it survival food was its second life. The leftover mush was poured into a pan, left to set firm overnight, then sliced and fried the next day in whatever grease the kitchen had saved. Fried mush tasted almost like a treat. The same nickel's worth of cornmeal became 2 different meals, and nothing was thrown out. Farm families across the South and the Midwest had eaten this for generations. During the Depression, the soup kitchens simply cooked it by the barrel. Number 22, navy bean soup. If there was one pot that defined the relief kitchen, it was the bean pot. Dried navy beans cost about 5 cents a pound and swelled to 3 times their size in water, which meant a small sack could feed a crowd. Cooks soaked them overnight, then simmered them for hours with an onion and whatever scrap of salt pork the donation box held until the beans burst open and the starch thickened the broth into something creamy and pale. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was nearly impossible to ruin. A bowl of bean soup delivered real protein, the kind that kept a working man upright through a day of hard labor or a long walk between hiring lines. The United States Senate had been serving essentially the same soup in its own dining room since 1903. In the 1930s, the same recipe fed the men who could not afford to eat it all. Number 21. Cabbage soup. A single head of cabbage cost almost nothing and cooked down into a pot big enough to matter. Relief cooks quartered it, dropped it into salted water with an onion and maybe a potato, and let it simmer until the cabbage turned silky and sweet and gave up its pale green broth. It was watery, humble, and it smelled like the inside of every tenement hallway in a working-class neighborhood. But cabbage held a secret the cooks did not have words for. It was packed with vitamin C, which meant that even in the dead of winter, when fresh fruit was a fantasy, a bowl of cabbage soup helped keep the men from getting sick. It kept for days. It reheated better than it cooked the first time, and it stretched forever. When times were hardest, a head of cabbage and a pot of water was the difference between something and nothing. Number 20. Potato soup. Potatoes were the backbone of Depression survival, cheap by the bushel and grown in every backyard and vacant lot that could hold a garden. Relief kitchens diced them and simmered them in water with an onion until the potatoes broke apart and thickened the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. A splash of donated evaporated milk turned it richer. A pad of margarine floated golden on top if the barrel was not empty. What made potato soup so valuable was that it asked nothing of the person eating it. It was soft. For the old men in the line with no teeth, for the children too young to chew, for the sick and the exhausted, potato soup went down easy and stayed down. A 5-cent bag of potatoes fed a family for 2 days. In a soup kitchen, that same bag fed a line of 40. Number 19. Split pea soup. Dried split peas were the workhorse of the relief pantry because, unlike other beans, they dissolved. A cook dropped them into a pot with an onion, a carrot, and a leftover ham bone begged from a butcher, and after an hour of simmering, the peas melted into a thick green porridge so dense you could stand a spoon in it. The ham bone gave up every last thread of smoky flavor it had, and the broth turned rich enough to coat the mouth and warm a person from the inside out. It was cheap, it was nearly impossible to burn, and it got thicker the longer it sat, which meant a cook could walk away and tend the line and come back to find dinner improved. Hospitals served it, mess halls served it, and every soup kitchen from Boston to Los Angeles kept a pot of it going all winter long. First pattern break. Here is where the truth about the Depression gets uncomfortable. These meals were not invented by chefs. They were invented by desperation, and they were kept alive by an army of ordinary women, church volunteers, and out-of-work cooks who understood something the rest of us have forgotten. Feeding a hungry person is not about flavor. It is about dignity. The men who stood in those lines had been machinists and clerks and farmers and fathers just a year or two before. They had owned homes. They had paid taxes. And now they stood in the cold holding a tin cup, and the only thing standing between them and total collapse was a woman with a ladle who looked them in the eye and gave them a full bowl instead of a half one. The soup did not fix the economy, but it kept people human long enough to survive until it did. Number 18. Barley soup. Barley was one of the cheapest grains a relief kitchen could buy, and it had a magic property that made it perfect for feeding a crowd. It swelled. A single cup of dry barley absorbed enormous amounts of water and expanded into a chewy, filling mass that turned a thin broth into a substantial meal. Cooks simmered it with whatever vegetables came in that day, an onion, a few carrots, a handful of the outer cabbage leaves nobody else wanted, and let the barley do the work of making it stick to your ribs. It cost almost nothing, and it delivered slow-burning energy that lasted for hours, which mattered enormously to men who did not know when their next meal would come. Barley soup was plain, it was gray, and it was one of the most efficient calories per penny meals ever ladled out of an American kettle. Number 17, milk toast. This was the gentlest meal in the relief kitchen, the one saved for the sick, the elderly, and the smallest children. Stale bread was toasted, torn into a bowl, and covered with hot milk, sweetened with a little sugar if the kitchen had any. That was the entire recipe. It cost almost nothing, using up bread too hard to eat any other way, and milk that was close to turning. But for a child running a fever, or an old man who could no longer manage a bowl of hard beans, milk toast was salvation. It was warm, it was soft, it required no chewing, and it went down when nothing else would. Mothers made it at home for a sick child as an act of love. In the soup kitchens, it was made by the potful for anyone too frail for the regular line. It tasted like being cared for when the whole world had stopped caring. Number 16, creamed chipped beef on toast. The men who had been in the service called it by a name we cannot print, and everyone else called it SOS. But in the relief kitchens, it was simply a hot meal that felt like a real dinner. Dried, heavily salted beef, the cheapest cut of meat that existed, was torn into strips and stirred into a thick white sauce made of flour, margarine, and milk, then poured steaming over toast. The saltiness of the beef seasoned the whole sauce for free, so no other seasoning was needed. A tiny amount of meat stretched across an enormous number of servings, which is exactly why the kitchens loved it. The toast soaked up the gravy and turned soft and rich beneath the weight of it. For a man who had not tasted meat in a week, that first bite of salty, creamy, beef-flecked gravy over hot bread was the closest thing to a proper supper the Depression could offer. Number 15, Mulligan stew. This was the meal of the men riding the rails, the hobos and drifters who followed the freight trains looking for work, and it was pure improvisation. A group of men would gather at a trackside camp, a hobo jungle, and each would contribute whatever he had scavenged that day. One man had a potato, another had half an onion, a third had a carrot pulled from a field, a fourth had a scrap of meat begged from a back door. It all went into a single communal pot over an open fire, seasoned with salt and whatever wild greens grew nearby, and simmered until it became a thick, unpredictable stew that fed everyone in the camp. No two pots were ever the same. The genius of Mulligan's stew was not the recipe. It was the idea that four men with nothing could combine their nothing into a real meal, and that generosity, not the ingredients, was what kept people alive. Number 14, dandelion greens. When the money ran out completely and even the cheapest vegetable was too expensive, Americans turned to the one crop that grew for free in every field, vacant lot, and roadside ditch in the country: dandelion greens. Families and relief cooks alike gathered them by the basketful in spring, before the plants flowered and turned bitter, and cooked them down with a scrap of salt pork or bacon grease until the tough leaves wilted into something tender and earthy. They were free, they were everywhere, and they were quietly one of the most nutritious things a hungry person could eat, loaded with iron, calcium, and vitamins that a diet of bread and beans simply could not provide. What looked like a weed to a rich man looked like dinner to a poor one. Families who foraged dandelions through the lean years were, without knowing it, feeding their children better than the science of the day understood. Second pattern break. Here is something the history books gloss over. The Great Depression did not just make people poor, it rewrote what Americans knew about food. For 100 years, the country had been getting richer, and every generation had learned to cook with a little more butter, a little more meat, a little more waste than the one before. Then, the money vanished overnight, and suddenly millions of people had to relearn skills their grandmothers had known and their mothers had forgotten. How to make a soup from a bone, how to stretch 1 pound of beans across 3 days, how to turn a weed into a vegetable. The knowledge had never disappeared. It had just gone quiet, waiting in the memory of the old people until the whole country needed it again all at once. And when the good times came back, we forgot it a second time, faster than before. Number 13, macaroni and tomatoes. Long before macaroni and cheese became a boxed convenience, poor families and relief kitchens made a simpler, cheaper version that filled the same need. Elbow macaroni was boiled, drained, and tossed back in the pot with a can of tomatoes broken up by hand, a little salt, and a spoonful of bacon grease if there was any. That was it. A box of macaroni cost a nickel and a can of tomatoes about a dime, and together they fed a family with plenty left over for the next day. The starch of the pasta and the acid of the tomatoes made something surprisingly satisfying, brighter and more filling than either one alone. It was the kind of meal a mother could put together in 15 minutes with 2 pantry cans and feel like she had fed her children a real dinner instead of another bowl of thin soup. Before we hit the next one, you can grab our cookbook bundles on our website and make these depression recipes in your own kitchen. Pause and scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description or pinned comment. Number 12, red beans and rice. In the relief kitchens of the South, and especially in New Orleans, no meal stretched further than a pot of red beans served over rice. Dried kidney beans cost a few cents a pound and cooked low and slow all day with an onion and whatever scrap of smoked meat the kitchen had, until the beans turned creamy and the broth turned thick and rich. Ladled over a scoop of cheap white rice, that single pot could feed dozens, and the rice doubled the volume of the meal for almost nothing. The beauty of it was that it demanded no attention. You put the pot on in the morning, and it took care of itself until supper. For a working man who spent his last dime on a bowl, red beans and rice tasted like it had been cooked with far more money than it actually cost. That illusion of abundance was worth as much as the calories. Number 11, lentil soup. Lentils had one advantage that made them a favorite of every overworked relief cook in America. They did not need soaking. Unlike navy beans or split peas, which had to sit in water overnight, lentils went straight from the bag into the pot and cooked soft in half an hour, breaking down into a thick, earthy soup that stuck to your ribs. A cook could decide at noon to make lentil soup and have it feeding the line by early afternoon. They simmered them with an onion, a carrot, and a little salt, and the result was cheap, fast, and packed with the protein and iron that kept malnourished men on their feet. A pound of lentils cost pennies and fed a crowd. For a kitchen scrambling to feed a line that grew longer every single day, the speed of lentils was as valuable as their price. Number 10, baked beans. When a church or a relief group wanted to serve something that felt like a Sunday meal instead of another thin soup, they made baked beans. Navy beans were simmered until tender, then baked low and slow for hours with molasses, a little mustard, and a scrap of salt pork until the whole pot turned dark, sweet, and thick. The long baking transformed cheap dried beans into something that tasted rich and almost celebratory. Molasses was one of the cheapest sweeteners in the country, and it did double duty here, adding both flavor and quick energy. A pot of baked beans and a slice of bread was a filling, satisfying supper that cost next to nothing but felt like effort and care had gone into it. In New England especially, where this was a Saturday night tradition long before the Depression, the relief kitchens simply kept the pot going for anyone who was hungry. Number 9, corn chowder. In the farm country of the Midwest, corn was the one thing there was almost always enough of, and corn chowder turned that abundance into a hot, filling meal. A cook simmered a diced potato in a little water until tender, then added canned or dried corn and a splash of milk and let it all heat through until it thickened into a golden, sweet, velvety soup. The starch from the potato and the corn thickened the pot on its own, so there was no need for expensive flour or butter to make a roux. It was hearty, it was comforting, and it tasted like something a family might have eaten in better times, which mattered more than anyone admitted. For children who were tired of gray soup and hard beans, a bowl of sweet golden corn chowder was a small mercy in a hard winter. Number 17, meatloaf with tomato glaze and green beans. Third pattern break. Here is the part that should stop you cold. At the very worst of the Great Depression, a quarter of the country was out of work, and the men in those bread lines were not lazy, and they were not failures. They were the same men who had built the roads and run the factories and farmed the land, and the machine had simply stopped through no fault of their own. The soup kitchens understood something the politicians of the day fought bitterly over. A hungry person cannot look for work. A starving man cannot rebuild anything. Before you can fix an economy, you have to keep its people alive, and you have to keep them from losing hope. Every bowl of bean soup was a small argument that the country was still worth saving. The food was cheap. What it bought, time, dignity, the will to keep going, was priceless. Number 8, bread soup. When there was nothing left but stale bread and water, there was still a meal in it. Relief cooks and poor families alike tore day-old bread into chunks and dropped it into a pot with water, an onion, a clove of garlic, and a little salt, then simmered it until the bread dissolved into a thick, porridge-like stew. A drizzle of any fat on top made it richer. It was the meal that said the cupboard was nearly empty and dinner was happening anyway. Italian immigrant families had brought versions of this to the tenement kitchens of New York decades earlier, and during the Depression, it spread through every neighborhood where a stale loaf was too precious to waste. It cost almost nothing. It used up the one thing every kitchen had too much of, and it filled a stomach on a night when filling a stomach was the only goal that mattered. Number 7, soup kitchen Mulligan. The Capone kettle. This was the meal that Al Capone's Chicago soup kitchen ladled out by the thousands in the winter of 1930 and 1931, and it fed more of that city's hungry than any official effort. It was a stew in the loosest sense, a thin, meaty broth built from donated beef bones, cheap cuts, potatoes, onions, carrots, and whatever the neighborhood grocers and butchers were pressured into giving. It simmered in enormous kettles and was served hot with a chunk of bread, 3 meals a day, to anyone who walked in, no questions asked. The line stretched down the block. Whatever you think of the man who paid for it, and there is plenty to think, the kettle was real, and the hunger it met was real. For thousands of Chicagoans that winter, a bowl of that stew was the only hot food they saw all day, and it kept them alive when nothing else would. Number 6. Oatmeal and hot cereal. The relief kitchens and the churches served enormous quantities of oatmeal because it was one of the cheapest, most filling breakfasts a body could get. A single box of rolled oats cooked down into a huge pot of thick, warm cereal that could feed a long line of men and children before they faced the cold. Sweetened with a little molasses or sugar if the kitchen had it, or eaten plain when it did not, oatmeal delivered slow-burning energy that lasted through a morning of walking and looking for work. It was gentle on empty stomachs, easy on old teeth, and warm in a way that mattered enormously on a January morning. For a child heading to school with nothing else coming until who knew when, a hot bowl of oatmeal was the one dependable thing in an undependable world. Number 5. Spaghetti in tomato sauce. Spaghetti was one of the great bargains of the Depression, cheap, filling, and able to stretch a tiny amount of sauce across an enormous number of servings. Relief kitchens boiled great vats of spaghetti and coated it in a thin tomato sauce made from canned tomatoes, an onion, garlic, and whatever herbs were on hand, and served it up in bowls that filled a stomach for pennies a portion. Italian-American families had been eating this for years, and during the hard times, the wider country learned and learned what they already knew, that a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes could feed a family for almost nothing and leave everyone satisfied. The starch was cheap energy. The tomato was bright and cheerful against a monotony of gray soups, and children who would turn up their noses at another bowl of beans ate spaghetti with something close to joy. Number 4, bread pudding. Even in a soup kitchen, there was room for something sweet, and bread pudding was how you made dessert out of garbage. Stale bread that was too hard to serve any other way was torn up and soaked in milk sweetened with sugar and whatever spice the kitchen had, cinnamon if they were lucky, then baked until it set into a warm, custardy pudding. Raisins went in if there were any. It cost almost nothing, using up the bread nobody could eat and milk that was about to turn, and it turned that waste into something that tasted like a treat. For children who had forgotten what dessert was, and for grown men worn down by a diet of soup and bread, a warm square of bread pudding was a small piece of comfort, proof that hard times had not erased sweetness from the world entirely. Nothing was wasted, and everyone got a taste of something better. Number 3, donuts and coffee. This was the image that came to define the breadlines of the Depression. The men in worn coats holding a donut in one hand and a tin cup of coffee in the other. Donuts were shockingly cheap to make in bulk, just flour, a little sugar, and hot fat, and they could be fried by the hundreds and handed out fast to a moving line. They cost a fraction of a penny each and delivered a quick, dense burst of energy from the fat and the sugar that helped a hungry man make it through a cold morning. Paired with hot coffee, it was warm, fast, and filling enough to matter. The Salvation Army and countless church groups fried them by the thousands. It was not a balanced meal, and nobody pretended it was. But on a freezing morning with a line stretching down the block, a hot donut and a cup of coffee was mercy you could hold in your hands. Number 2, Hoover stew. Named bitterly for the president, many blamed for the whole catastrophe, Hoover stew was the meal of the Hoovervilles, the shanty towns of scrap wood and tar paper where the homeless gathered on the edges of every city. It was a thin stew of whatever was cheapest and most available: macaroni, canned tomatoes, canned beans, and sliced up hot dogs, when a few pennies could be found for them, all simmered together in one pot over a communal fire. The name was an insult and a joke, and a survival strategy all at once, a way of pointing the finger while still getting fed. It cost almost nothing. It stretched to feed everyone in the camp, and the different textures, the soft pasta, the beans, the little coins of meat, made it feel like more of a meal than its ingredients had any right to. It was poverty food, wearing a president's name like a scar. Number 1, bean soup. At the very top of the list is the meal so plain that naming it almost feels like a letdown, and yet nothing on this list did more to keep America alive. Just dried beans, whatever kind was in the barrel, simmered in water with an onion, a little salt, and whatever scrap of cured pork the donation box happened to hold, cooked until the beans broke down and thickened the whole pot into something that could carry a human being through another day. It appears in every oral history of the Great Depression, from the coal camps of Appalachia to the tenements of Chicago to the Dust Bowl towns of the plains. A pound of dried beans cost a nickel and fed a family for 2 days. Nothing in the American kitchen has ever done more for less. When the money was gone, and the work was gone, and hope was running thin, a pot of bean soup was still possible, and as long as it was still possible, so was tomorrow. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The bean soup, the potato soup, the cornmeal mush, the red beans and rice. Then sit down and eat it slow, and think about the people who made it not because it was trendy, but because it was all they had. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the bean soup gets more love than the Hoover stew, because these were never just recipes. They were proof that a bowl of almost nothing, handed over with a little kindness, was enough to keep a whole country on its feet.